Guys, I'm super excited to introduce you to Jeffrey Davis. Jeffrey's book, Tracking Wonder, got put on my radar a few months back by a good friend who said, Steve, I just think you are going to resonate with this content. And she was right. I ended up getting the book on Audible so Jeffrey could actually read it to me. And I consumed it twice. I loved it that much. The approach that he takes to helping stimulate your curiosity and this wonder filled approach to the world, I think, is so powerful and so necessary. We sort of lose that as we leave sort of adolescence and move into adulthood, and we get distracted with our lives and our careers. And it's really unfortunate because we all live in a wonder filled life and world. And there's so much beauty, so much to explore and experience. And it's that wonder, having that sense of wonder that can really stimulate your creativity and your innovation and has so much applicability to our work and to our just our general levels of happiness. I love the fact that when I look on Jeffrey's website, the interesting thing that I see is he's considered the pack leader of Tracking Wonder. That's his company. And he calls himself a branding consultant, chief wonder tracker, author, and a big picture map maker. I love that. His official bio is Jeffrey Davis is a writer, speaker, consultant, and author of 4 books. Through his venture and consultancy, Tracking Wonder, he works with creative innovators, entrepreneurs, and social psychologists to help people flourish in times of challenge and change. He lives with his wife and their 2 little girls in a farmhouse in the Hudson Valley of New York. I am so stoked he agreed to be on the Ripple Effect podcast. So let's jump right in. All right, well, fantastic. Well, guys, I'm super excited to introduce you to Jeffrey Davis. As I said in the introduction, I'm a huge fan. And so this is a big moment for me. So I am grateful, Jeffrey, that you agreed to come on the Ripple Effect podcast. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your inviting me.
I'm excited. I was telling everybody in the intro that I was turned on to your book by a mutual friend, and she had said, "Steve, this is a book that I think you're really going to dig because I'm all about thinking outside the box. The whole concept of what I do with the Ripple is try to find unique ways to connect and engage with people." And she saw this book, and she's like, "I just know it's right up your alley." And so I got the Audible version, and because I needed you to read it to me. I wanted
That's
to hear
great.
it directly from your lips, and I loved it. I went back through it twice, and it was just I've got to say you are really onto something because I think really the value of what you talk about connecting and engaging through different methodologies and approaches in terms of understanding the wonder that we all have in our lives if we're just willing to dig a little bit deeper and look it really transcends every aspect of our not only our personal lives, but our professional career paths and our lives there.
It does. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your just like really opening it right up into the subject of wonder. It's something that's so obvious. It's so pervasive to the human condition. These
Yep.
experiences of wonder, and yet they're not something that we typically talk about. At least not in the context of, say, business or entrepreneurship or being a grown up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been this. Ongoing journey for a number of years trying to understand what is wonder, uh, how can we experience it more, why would we want to, why are we biologically wired to experience wonder. Yeah.
Well, so let's go back a little bit if you don't mind. I'm a big believer in the origin story. So, obviously I got a sense from your writing, right? That you've sort of always had this sense of curiosity dating all the way back to a young child. But tell us a little bit about your upbringing, in kind of the environment you grew up in, and was this something that your parents kind of stimulated in you, and you've just taken it and expanded upon it as you've gone into your later years with this work?
Yeah, well, this is a great question. It operates on many levels for me because in much of my work, I'm either researching or talking with or even consulting with people, exploring sometimes memories about when they were younger. So it turns out I think about my younger self almost every morning as part of my morning practice. So um, I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, which is much more of a city than some people might associate with.
Yeah.
Several 100,000 people, and yet. Where I was most alive was in an undeveloped lot, which we all called the woods. It seemed really
Yeah.
big back then. I didn't realize it was just an undeveloped lot back then. I thought it was magic land,
Yeah.
and that's where I spent most of my days. So fully alive was outdoors. Kind of as being this quiet path maker. So I like to make other paths for others that
Hmm.
came through, and very imaginative and much more creative than competitive. Um, I was an imaginative world maker. So I was illustrating serial cartoons that I'd created.
Really?
The Disguiser. I'd created this character as the
Oh,
Disguiser.
nice.
So my grandfather ran a printing company, and he would always make these drawing pads for me, these collated drawing pads. And he was one who gave me the encouragement early on. Maybe someday you could become a Disney Imagineer, and
Yeah.
things like that. So that's where I felt really alive. And my mother also encouraged it in the sense that she never pushed me to be or to do anything except what really sparked me. So
Yeah.
she led me to Fort Worth's many wonderful art museums, the Kimball, the Amon Carter, the Modern Art Museum. That's where I felt alive. That's where I felt, most sparked. And my father was he worked in Dallas, lived in Fort Worth, commuted to Dallas in the TV, radio, advertising, and media world and sales
Yeah.
world. And he was very much the word person. He was much more creative than his culture and time could ever give him credit for. But he did give me a love of language. And oddly enough, at probably 6 or 7 years old, he gave me his father, who died when my father was probably 13. He still had one of his father's appointment notebooks that he had given my
Oh,
father as a
yeah.
diary. And so then my father gave me that same appointment notebook to start recording my thoughts when I was about 6 or 7, when I couldn't really write. And I was
Yeah.
like, thoughts? What is that? So, but that is where I started getting the idea of actually recording my ideas and thoughts. And I did that for quite a while. So that was part of my upbringing and nurturing of that spirit. When I look back, those qualities have stayed alive with me on into my teenagehood. Um, by the time I was 19, I was recognizing my imagination was different and I
Yeah.
wanted to keep it alive. So I started studying writing more deliberately, psychology, philosophy later in grad school, philosophy, um, all as ways to kind of keep alive that inner life. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really, fascinating. You and I have a very similar childhood. It's amazing how different the world is now, right? We could probably leave, at the crack of dawn, not come home until dinner, and that was pretty much my childhood. My bike was my gateway, right? And I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so we had
Oh yeah, I
mesas
know that.
and arroyos that we could go play in, and everything was we either had our kingdoms or our territories or our hideaways, and we always did these things just to it was just a constant evolution of just using our imagination, because back then you didn't have game systems and you didn't have all the distractions kids today have. The outside and what you could find out there on your adventures was really your toy, right? That was the
It,
that was the tool.
it's so true. And actually, both my girls, I have an 8-year-old and 13-year-old daughter, and both of them know that it's futile anymore to tell me that they're bored. Because I say that's great. So what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
They don't have devices or any of those sorts of distractions. And I think grown-ups are the ones that are um, daunted by distractions now too,
Yeah.
right? They're the ones that are like, oh my gosh, I've forgotten what it's like to be creatively bored too. So I so appreciate that. You remind me too of just like one more childhood game that I would play with myself. We would move sometimes around Fort Worth and go to new neighborhoods, and I would hop on my bike and try my best to get lost and then find my way back just through instincts. And I think I still do that. I think that,
Uh-huh.
metaphorically, I think I'm
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
always trying to push myself beyond the known territory and see if I can find my way back.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
that's fantastic. So, did you live in Fort Worth up until you went to college, and
Went
then
to
did you
college
ever go
and
back?
yeah, I went to college in UT Austin,
Okay.
and then at UT Dallas grad school, and then left, came up to upstate New York, Hudson Valley, New York, where I live now. But I spent a good time in Dallas teaching and researching and heading up an institute there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do go back to Fort Worth. I went back this past spring to see my mother and my sister for the first time in 3 years since the pandemic, and I loved it. And I found the new bike trails along the Trinity River, and my daughters and I would get on the bikes. We didn't get lost, although I did one time, actually in the neighborhood. And I had to come back and tell my daughters, I actually got lost again.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, it's still a very livable city in some parts. Probably not this time of year. I wouldn't go back. It's probably 105 right now, but other times it's very livable.
I'm in Austin right now, and we're
Oh,
expecting
there you
109
go.
today. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
this is
brutal.
just
Yeah.
unprecedented heat down here. I tell you what,
Well, you guys get it, I think, pretty often, but it is definitely unprecedented.
it
Yes, yeah.
it's
So even up
crazy.
here, it'll be in the 90s tomorrow in upstate New York, and that's pretty high for here.
Yeah, that's stretching it for you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I have a good friend that lives in the Hudson Valley, and she loves it. That's where she grew up. She was down here in Austin for a while, and she's been out to Hollywood and sort of done all that stuff, and then came back and was doing some on-air personality kind of work here. And then she just said, I'm just tired of the heat. I'm moving back where I know I enjoy the environment a lot more.
The environment's really important even for our imagination and our context and our well-being. And, curious enough, when my mother was taking me to the Kimball Art Museum as a boy, I would play that game, as I'm sure you would and others would, like put myself in certain paintings. And it turns out I was really drawn toward the few paintings from the Hudson Valley School of Painters from back in the early 1800s, like Tom Cole and
Wow.
so forth. And then later I would study about that school of art and fantasize like living someplace like in the Catskill Mountains at some point.
Yeah.
And somehow I found my way here, and we have a good 3/4 of an acre pond in the back and woods and so forth. So I feel very at home here. And there was something obviously in that boyhood imagination that was drawing me toward this landscape. And I think that's probably true for a lot of us. We probably um, are drawn towards certain landscapes, or if we felt really alive in a certain landscape as a child, sometimes we try to recreate that landscape, which is
Yeah,
what I think I
absolutely.
was doing with those woods. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know you mentioned that in your book, talking about Walden Woods and sort of the connection to the outdoors. And I have that same type of affinity for that. I feel like I'm at home or at peace when I'm in a mountain or nearby a mountain, just to have that, because I grew up with that. I went to the mountains as often as I possibly could because that's where all the adventure was, right? And it's so great as adults to be able to come back. And I think something that I'd be curious about your perspective is, I think a lot of times we don't leverage those memories the way that we should in order to reground ourselves, or to, maybe calm ourselves down in times of stress or frustration. Going back and sort of revisiting those things, even through our mind's eye, those adventures we had, those environments that really, meant something to us, they're still in there. A lot of times, if we're not digging deep enough, we don't unlock that.
That is a beautiful way to frame that inquiry. Because just right now, I'm getting a scan of some of the conversations I have with clients and others about what the workplace is like for them, or what the work from home environment is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
for them, and and how on earth can they feel alive in their work, given certain circumstances. And never would they think, that going back to younger memories might be fruitful for them in some ways other than to escape.
Yeah.
And so this really ties directly to a key part of my work, which is, yeah, it's something that an early, let's say, positive psychologist in Greece, Aristotle, referred to as our daemon, which is this Greek word, this daemon. It's like a force of character within each of us that's kind of been with us since before we were born. It's sort of this innate force of character. It's kind of complex, but if we really tap into that unique force in us, it can sort of guide us toward what makes us most alive, most feel as if we're flourishing. What
Yeah.
I'm sharing with you is actually the basis of a lot of the psychologist Marty Seligman's thinking when he co-founded what's called positive psychology a number of years ago. So Aristotle had this idea that we're each born with this daemon, and it's this force of character that can guide each of us. It's unique to you. Mine's unique to me. Your
Hmm.
mother has a unique one. And so forth. The challenge is, of course, we forget it. We're born sort of
Yeah.
wide-eyed in wonder. We're born wide-eyed, not knowing,
Yeah.
not knowing who we are, which can be a beautiful, liberating thing when we
Yeah.
kind of forget who we think we are. So- but the but children, many children have an innate capacity where they're drawn toward, if they're given the freedom and latitude, drawn toward certain activities they're just naturally drawn toward,
Hmm.
right? And it differs. My two daughters, they have commonalities, but they also have very different forces of character, very different types of activities they're drawn to. So my experience, I'm going to connect this dot with your question. My experience has been in my research and so many what I would call fulfilled innovators is that they either remember that sort of force of character
Hmm.
on a regular basis, or if they've forgotten it after several decades, which is common too, they reclaim it. They reclaim, who was I
Yeah.
when I was at my best, when I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old?
Yep.
Now, daemon in Greek translates loosely in English to genius, right? Genius,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what Aristotle calls like the pursuit of happiness that we talk about in the United States is really the pursuit of what's called eudaimonia. It's like
Yep.
which activities most bring alive your genius. Okay. So one thing that's just like so spot on with your great questions, like how can we leverage these memories, is on a regular basis, and I do this every morning, is
Really.
to remember a time when you were younger. And I'm going to qualify this in a moment for those of us who might have had troubled childhoods and traumatic childhoods. But it's still to remember a time when you were younger and you felt alive and free to express yourself uniquely without
Yeah.
regard necessarily for reward. What were you doing? Who were you with? Were you in solitude? Were you indoors, outdoors? And how were you showing up in your unique way? If there were
Yeah.
others around, how did you stand out or not stand out? And like really try to see that self with appreciation, even compassion. Because for many of us, probably we remember not being seen for
Yeah.
who we
Yeah. Oh,
were
yeah.
when we were
Yeah.
8 or 9. My
Yep.
father loved me, but he would ask my mother, she told me this later, Jeffrey's kind of slow. Like, how is he going to get by in the world? He's and I was just a slow processor. I was quiet,
Yeah.
and he couldn't really see me at that time. He saw me later, but he couldn't really see me. So we had to see ourselves when we were younger and really appreciate them. Now, people like Oprah, let's just take Oprah as a good example, because this is hard work for many people. And so if you have to go a little older because
Hmm.
things are just too troubling, that's okay. If you go back to like when you were a teenager, that's okay. But Oprah had a very troubled and traumatic childhood, as many of us know. Grew up in Mississippi in poverty, to a single mother. And um, by the time I think she was 2.5 years old, her grandmother started to raise her, had taught her how to read. And by the time she was 2 or 3 years old,
Mm.
she preached to her church congregation on like the resurrection of Jesus, something like that. Right. Now let's think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
Right. Because of course she then had trauma after that. But look at Oprah now, and she like keeps alive. She's reclaimed
Yeah.
that young genius spirit. I mean, she is a preacher of sorts, right? About
Yeah. Yeah.
renewal and hope
Absolutely.
and so forth. So, for those of us who feel like, man, we are burnt out with our work or we're not feeling the joy in life, just try that out. Just try remembering a time when you were younger and you felt alive and free. Write down that memory because it's going to stoke more memories. And then try to write down like what are the adjectives you would use to describe your genius, so to
Yeah.
speak, when it was fully activated? And how can you bring that to your days right now? Right. So I
Yeah.
ask myself every morning, like, how can I be imaginative? How can I be um, grounded and connected the way I was at my best when I was younger? So that
Yeah.
was a long way of responding to that question, but it just hit it's at
I
the
love
heart of
that.
so
No.
much of what I'm thinking about and working with people on.
Well, it's fantastic because when I do professional coaching, I often start with my client trying to help them realize that everybody, when you were like you said, when you were a kid, everything was, wide open for us. We didn't really have labels. We didn't necessarily have sort of status. Anybody could be a friend. Everybody was, the world was full of possibility. And we get older, and like you said, we get into competitive sports. There's competition involved. We start to kind of, the society sort of cultures us down a certain path. And if you have an upbringing, good or bad, that obviously influences it. But, if you can, as an adult, somehow figure out that right now you control, where you are and what you're doing. And that wide-eyed enthusiasm that you might have had as a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old kid, all the way up until, when you started down whatever path you did, you still have the ability to reimagine what you want your life to be now and what it can be in the future. And
Completely.
yeah,
And if you
I,
find the activities, right, even the
yeah,
activities at work that like, okay, 20% actually shows to be a pretty good ratio with some research. If you find 20% of what you do during the day activates your young genius, like if you are activated by spreadsheets, like more power to you and
yeah,
bring spreadsheets to the
we need
team,
people
right?
like you for sure. I'm
Completely.
not one, but whatever. No
That's
judgment.
what makes creativity happen, or the people who love
Sure.
spreadsheets,
Yeah.
And so seriously, so, whatever it is that activates you, like keep trying to do more of that. Don't expect it 100%, but try to up the ratio, right? I have like you, like lawyers and psychologists, organizational consultants, strength trainers, and business owners who do activate their genius, so to speak,
Yeah.
activate their it makes a complete big difference in many ways. And maybe a couple of ways I can outline that. It correlates with a greater sense of well-being, as you can imagine, but also it does something to our creativity. Our creativity, you could define as your ability to derive and act on both novel and useful insights.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're like you've got this problem at work, your meetings suck. You want to find a novel and useful way to make meetings suck less. Okay,
Yeah.
then you're trying to be engaged in creativity. Um, Actually, this type of work that we're talking about, like really drawing upon these character strengths, these genius character strengths, expands your internal repertoire, so to speak. Your cognitive range
Yeah.
broadens, and you're able to pull. You're more aware sometimes of insights from your environment or other things people say to derive a novel and useful solution. Could I give you? I'll give you an example of
Yeah.
Arianna Huffington.
Yeah.
Right. So most of us have heard of Arianna Huffington because of the Huffington Post. Many of us may not know that several years before that, she was in a miserable marriage by her own account
Yeah.
to a very high profile, battle torn politician. And she was pretty miserable. And she had certain notions of who she was supposed to be in her social circles and how she was supposed to think in her social circles. And she's Greek. She's Greek origin. She kind of gets Aristotle's idea too. In fact, she was researching a book on Greek gods and goddesses. She used to author a few books before the
Hmm.
Huffington Post. And it was while she was researching, she revisits this force of character called Hermes. And Hermes is like the childlike, precocious
Hmm. Yeah.
God. Like, I think he was like 2 days old and he was admitted to Mount Olympus, for
Yeah.
his precociousness and cleverness and
Yep.
flexible and like fluid and shape shifting. So when she was studying that, it reminded her for the first time of when she was a little girl and who she used to be, kind of like what we're talking about. So she started, like, as she would say, like nurturing her inner Hermes, like trying to
Yeah.
find again who she was when she was younger. And the more she did that, the less locked in she was to just pure rationality and much more open to intuitive serendipity. And as she says, wonder. That gave her the broadness of mind and the healthy self-regard eventually to leave that marriage and to test out this crazy idea that everybody thought was nuts, investors and colleagues, to launch a website that was full of news and
Yep.
was full of news like health and well-being. And people are like, who's going to read a bunch of blogs online? Who's going to read a bunch of
Mhm.
news online? Who's
Yeah.
going to read a bunch of
Yeah.
news about health and well-being and so forth? And she went for it anyway.
Turns out
Um,
all of us. I
yeah,
mean,
exactly.
yeah.
Turns out exactly. She
Yeah.
did it anyway.
Wildly
And it was in
successful.
part that fostering of wonder, which now
Yeah.
she's since sold the Huffington Post, has now founded Thrive Global, which has its centerpiece wonder. And she
Yeah.
really recognized the power of tracking wonder, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example for sure. Well, it's funny because you talk about the young genius, just
Mm.
to sort of revisit that again, just really quickly for the audience. Like when you clarify it in your book, it's really identifying with that younger version of yourself. Do you have I know you talked to a number of people, you cite a bunch of different stories and examples, but do you have a favorite one of a young genius, that really stood out to you when you were researching for your book?
Oh, yeah. Well, probably quite a few. Maybe I'll just offer two
Okay.
that I'm thinking of. Yeah. Um, One is one is Evelyn Asher. So Evelyn, we kind of regard as the godmother of tracking wonders. She's now probably 82, and like I tell this story in part to say it's never too late to reclaim your
Yeah.
young genius, right? And so there are kind of like four parts to developing this skill set on a team or individually. Remember your young genius. So tap those memories, recognize, so actually identify those traits,
Yep.
and really re-see yourself. Third is to activate. So find those activities that do activate your genius now and reclaim. So even when things are hard, even when you're going to meet challenges, which we do every single day, how can I bring one or more of those traits with me instead of
Yep.
just shutting down in some default way? So Evelyn was about in her 60s, and she started trying to launch her own business. The way she describes it, she's pretty frustrated in launching her business. She's very attached to outcome and attached to certain standard measurements of success. Um, and then she started discovering my work, started working with her young genius. And what she remembered when she was a young genius was, I think she grew up maybe in the Carolinas or Georgia, the youngest of maybe with three older brothers. And I think they called her Miss Prissy because she was always interested in poetry and art and other things, artistically. And so she wasn't seen, right,
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
young dude. So she had to see herself. She had to see that genius. She had to recognize it and bring it forward. And the more she started fostering those qualities, it completely opened her up to artistic self, her photographic self, photography, and so forth. Completely
Wow.
shifted her attitude toward her business model. She started creating circles for women without attachment and just brought more people in and feels so fulfilled now, both in her business and her personal life. Evelyn still sends me notes about how she's tracking wonder almost every other week. And so
That's
that's one of my
awesome. Oh,
favorite
I
stories.
love that.
Yeah. Another is by Srini Pillai, who is a wonderful polymath, a neuroscientist. I think he was last working on a musical when I spoke with him as well. And Srini grew up in South Africa, and he was from India, grew up in South Africa. So he's still a person of color. And he and his mother were near a swimming pool at the time, and it's during apartheid, and he wanted to go swimming. She said, "I'm sorry, honey, you can't swim there." And he said, "But why not? Other children are swimming there." And she said, "You're not white, and or
Mm.
not white enough." And at that very moment, he said a drop of water from the swimming pool hit him, touched him, and it completely opened him with curiosity. And he often thinks of that moment because he stayed curious during that time in his life. And it was both that open curiosity coupled with his mother's love that really helped him navigate that childhood with a culture that clearly wasn't seeing his
Yeah.
genius.
Yeah.
And he is fully activated his polymath genius. So that's just, yeah, it's another one of my favorite stories.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, what I find, in the examples that you just gave, as well as the examples that you share in the book, is that a lot of these individuals have to sort of wake up and become their own advocate. Because if you wait for the world to discover you, if you weren't one of the chosen ones, right, you're gonna be
Yeah.
waiting a long time. And I think the interesting thing that I picked up from the book was how you have to be your own advocate, and you have to, say, you can't wait for it to happen. You're going to have to go make it happen.
Yes, and. So yes, and this is true. And what I want, the and piece is that we have to make it happen together.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a moment where I didn't want the book to be positioned, and I had many conversations um, with my publisher at Sounds True. Is very open. Like before we even made the deal, we were having, back in the day, she would take me to lunch in New York City. Like that
Yeah.
was, before the pandemic, and we were having conversations about the personal growth movement. And
Yeah.
I said, I don't want the book pigeonholed in personal growth. It's like it's transpersonal. Like I
It's
want us
bigger
to
than that. Yeah.
recognize we need to do our own work, but we need to do
Yeah.
our own work together.
Yeah.
And so, yes, we do need to assume some agency for activating our genius. We won't feel recognized even at work or in our family or our relationships sometimes. But the kind of beautiful reciprocal work that I have team members do where they're kind of blown away by the work is first to recognize their own genius and then even articulate some things out loud to other teammates and then do some work where they see each other's
Yeah.
genius.
Yeah.
And then you're like, right, that's a genius strength, right?
Yeah.
And so then you see how genius and creative potential operate in so many different ways. And then it can also be a powerful way for people to find right fit in their
Yep.
job or in their roles. Again, you're not always going to be fully activated all day long. That would be like being in wonder all day long, which would be a
Yeah.
little obnoxious. But we can up the wonder ratio, so to speak. So back to your point, yes, it does involve agency. It does involve us doing the work to recognize our own genius, but it's so much more beautiful in relationship. When I
Hmm.
unpack the 6 facets of wonder, which I wasn't expecting to do in my body of research. But these 6 facets of wonder, they're like the pair of foundational creative facets of openness and curiosity. And then there are the pair of facets when we're in deep crisis or uncertainty, sort of the disorienting facets of wonder, bewilderment and hope.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
then there's the third pair of facets which really help us experience wonder's social dimensions of connection and admiration.
Yeah.
And so it's in that connection and admiration where I wanted to offer that yes and piece. It
I
is up
love
to
that.
each of us, but here you and I are in this conversation, and even as I understand what uh, your whole mojo, Steve, is about, right? Is about connecting with other people and like even stretching yourself to connect with other people and probably champion other, like you're bringing me on here.
Yeah. Yep.
And sure, it's up to me to do my work, but you're helping me, be fully activated here, Steve.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
mission accomplished then, I guess, right? Well, it's funny for me connecting. I'm introverted and shy, and I grew up that way. And I played a lot as a child in isolation because I felt like I was the outsider. And so, that sense of wonder and that creativity that I often had to find was something that I had to self-stimulate. And I always was kind of funny, mainly because of the upbringing that I had. And it like you mentioned, we often become byproducts of that environment, right? But it was something that was actually kind of, there was shame around it. Right. You're in there
Mhm.
talking to yourself, or my thing was playing with my Star Wars figures, right? And coming up with different adventures. And like you, I would draw the backdrops, and I had this just very, I think, really amazing imagination. But then
Yeah.
I got criticized for it because at the time it's like, well, you need to put those things away, and start focusing on sports or whatever, and grow up, etc. But it was really reconnecting with those things when I realized how to re-engage and connect and sort of understand that that imagination was a real asset to me and served me so well as an entrepreneur. And when I stopped putting it in the corner where it was kind of in the shame bucket and brought it back out where I could actually embrace it and say, the right people are going to recognize it for what it is, and they're going to want a little bit of that. And then if you can encourage the other people to bring it out in themselves, like you said, that agency of, not just discover it in yourself, but then have the ability and the willingness to look beyond all of the labels and the prejudgments and the sort of the ways society cultures us, to dig below that surface and get to know that person and their creativity and where their genius is, and then encourage it to come out and play with you. I mean, you've really created something pretty significant, I think, at that point.
I can't agree more, and I really appreciate your sharing, bits of your background as well. We're very common in that regard. I was definitely the quiet rebel,
Yeah.
so by kindergarten, I've seen my photos. I was the only boy in the whole school with long hair down to my shoulder, but very quiet,
Yeah.
psychedelic pants, but very quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did play second base, in grade school, but I was the kid on second base that if, the kid from the other team made it to second base, I'd start talking to him and like wanting to be his friend. And he's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
"You got a game to play, buddy."
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I wanted to be in center field where I could just daydream,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think there are lots of Steves, right, in the
Yeah.
universe who often feel like those qualities aren't valued. And um, what I hope to be contributing to is not only people really discovering their genius character strengths and rediscovering them, but also discovering them in others as well,
Yeah.
particularly people in leadership positions or parents. And so
Absolutely.
again, I do consider it um, one of my roles. My girls know the term young genius too now. Like
Yeah.
they're very familiar with it. But I do think one of my roles is to watch each of their geniuses, to witness it, and sort of put them in different activities.
Hmm.
For instance, my 8-year-old has she's been wanting to wrestle since she was like 2 or 3 years old. She just loved to wrestle me and, like get me down to the ground and just like
That's
put her
awesome.
weight on and so forth. Whereas the older one, no way. Like, if I hug her too hard, she'll act like, ow, that hurt.
You're
She'll
breaking
joke
me.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so recently she entered her first Brazilian jiu-jitsu class.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
Only beginner, only girl at that trial class, but she stuck with it. And after the second class, she just this past week, she came out beaming. And
Yeah.
like I got emotional because I could see her genius being activated. And so
Yeah.
I do think that's kind of my role,
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
in fact, I hadn't thought of this, but before the first one was born, we didn't know if she would be a boy or a girl. And I thought, okay, I'll probably, it'll be a boy. He'll hate books. He'll hate art, and he'll want to be a wrestler. And I'll love him and like activate as wrestler. So
Yeah.
there's my younger daughter, right?
Yeah.
She's just fully activated as a wrestler, so to speak. Yeah,
Oh, that's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think you shared the jujitsu story on one of your Instagram stories. I was
I
telling
did.
everybody in the intro that they need to go and follow you on social, because I just get such a kick out of the stories that you're doing on both Instagram and Twitter. And then I love the canoe talk. I think that's just a genius idea, phenomenal.
Thank
I want to
you.
go back
Yeah,
to, something you said though, for work. The reality is that, and you mentioned it, right? Working with leaders, or as you said, a parent where you're leading, a young person into their life, and sort of being the good role model to sort of activate that genius. But leaders, I think, in a lot of organizations don't recognize and understand the responsibility that they have to be able to activate that for their employees. And so one of the questions I had for you was, how can you take the experience of wonder and curiosity to help us at work to create and support one another, and to create that culture environment where you're creating not only the safe place for everybody to activate their genius, but we're actually as organizations able to leverage that to become better because of it.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for that question, because a whole
Sure.
branch of Tracking Wonder Consultancy is working with teams and organizations. And, I'm going to say from the beginning, there are no easy answers
Right.
individually, and
Yeah.
certainly for a team, let alone for a whole work culture. So we have to be um, rooted and grounded possibility, pragmatic
Yeah.
possibility. Um, so some of the work, so I can offer like a quick thing for managers and team leaders who have direct reports, just to get started. Um, one of our greatest attributes we can exhibit these days as managers and leaders or business owners is caring,
Yeah.
genuine caring. So um, I have some clients develop a variation of a weekly check-in with these four questions. Um, One is kind of the hidden genius question. Uh, so number one is, what in your work this past week really brought you alive or brought fulfillment? And
I love that.
for direct reports who are, we all have a negativity bias. We're just on the spectrum of that. Like, some employees,
Yeah.
like, they're high on the negativity bias. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
they're like, boy, I'm going to have to really think about that. But
Yeah.
then it causes self-reflection and ownership and agency, as you noted. And then what the second question is really important. What in your work frustrated you this week, and how did you deal with it? But the frustration is really important to hear, because sometimes the manager or the leader is part of the frustration.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there needs to be that openness and communication to hear that. Um, and then the third pieces aren't necessarily tied to this, but they're still important. Third is like, what are your priorities for the coming week? And fourth is, how can I support you? Those first two are really important to help a manager or leader just start to see, oh, this person's really lit up here, really frustrated here. Maybe there's not quite the right fit. Can we either shift the frustration, or can we
Yeah.
shift the ratio toward more what's activating a person's genius? Um, then some of the other work is it has to start with themselves. So the leaders really have to first start recognizing, and activating their own genius, character
Yep.
strengths, and really doing that work themselves, and then modeling it, but then recognizing and remembering that everyone's genius is different. And so then finding ways, even in one-on-one um, conversations and check-ins, to find out, like, without being trepidatious on personal territory, what did bring them alive when they were
Yep.
younger, to actually have these personal conversations that aren't private. Personal without being private is really important these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really important that employees know that their leaders and managers care about them outside of work,
Yeah.
and that will help them be more present at work. So just being curious about somebody's background in terms of, like, what brought you alive when you were younger? It can be just that simple of a question, as a window into understanding how that person could be activated at work. So there's just a couple of things without needing a full Wonder Lab
Yeah.
intervention.
Well, it's interesting because those four questions super powerful. They one ties to one that I ask almost every single person that I come in contact with is, how can I help you? And if leaders got really good at that, most people will never have an answer for you, right? At least not the first 5, 6, 10 times you ask it. But if you keep
That's
asking it,
right.
and it comes from a place of authenticity, and you have a genuine desire to help that person achieve every level of success they can within the organization. I think where leaders miss it is they're not as open and honest about that, right? And I think what you're saying with those four questions is that process really requires that it comes from a place of heart, genuineness, and there is an element of accountability for the leader to say, look, I play a role in all of this, right? So what can I be doing to help pull the best of Jeffrey out so that we can all benefit from that, right? And part of that is obviously your TPS reports, turned in on
Yeah,
time, and those elements.
that's
But
right.
at the end of the day, those are transactional. I think the relational pieces, I think, are so critical, and I think that's where a lot of managers and bosses, they're not they're not digging deep enough anymore to get to that level. So I think you have to be, as a leader, willing to step outside that box and that comfort zone to embrace it, because when you do, you create that loyalty and that trust with that employee, and that's what everybody's desiring right now. I mean, that's why people are leaving organizations. They don't feel a kinship with the organization, with their managers, or with their coworkers, because nobody cares about, trying to get to know them.
It's true. And though my sympathies also go with the leaders and managers who,
Yeah.
there's always a gap, right? A human gap between what we desire and what we know how to do. So many leaders and managers like desire to do what we're talking about, but they don't know how. And they also know what works with one employee relationship doesn't work for another
Yep.
necessarily. But these are these are starting places. And what some of these inquiries do also is they foster co-agency and co-responsibility. So it's
Yep.
not the managers or leaders responsibility to make their employees happy. It's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
It's not. And nor is it to like create all of the ideal perfect conditions for them either. So there has to be co-responsibility and co-agency, but these inquiries and exercises are a starting place for that. And then to create, if you can identify an area of change for the culture or for the communication dynamics within many workplaces, if a leader or manager can get others on a team to create a communication experiment,
Yeah.
for instance,
Yeah.
for like the next 8 weeks, we're going to maintain boundaries on our communication, like no texting or no use of Slack or whatever the parameters are, or like each of you gets your 2 hours a week of deep thinking wonder time for like
Yeah.
for the next 8 weeks, we're going to try this out. Then what you've done is you've fostered two important facets of wonder: openness to new experience and curiosity on an experimental basis. Really important. But then the third facet is, of course, connection. And connection's really important, but it is where we allow ourselves to, wonder. We haven't defined it on this show yet, so I'll define it in a couple of
Yeah.
ways. Now,
Yep.
um, wonder is an experience that it's like instant mindfulness that's brought about by something that either delights us or disorients us or both,
Yep.
right? And the beauty of these experiences of wonder is that for a fleeting moment with rippling effects, to use Ripple,
Thank you. I love that.
exactly. For a fleeting moment, these experiences of wonder can dissolve our biases, can dissolve
Yeah.
our biased perceptions, so we can see what is real and true, what is beautiful and possible. And sometimes that means we develop unconscious biases pretty quickly with one another,
Yeah.
and we box each other in pretty quickly. And the longer we work with each other, sometimes the deeper those boxes come. And so, what these experiences can do as well is, for a moment, bust those bias
Yeah.
boxes, and we can see each other for a moment in our full sort of radiance, so to speak, just
Yeah.
enough to like, let's try this out together. Like, let's experiment and relate together differently.
Yeah, could you talk about it in the book, right? About the biases that we often have in it, the sort of the tendency, the natural tendency for us to prejudge other people. We tell ourselves these stories that we don't even have any basis for how the narrative ends up in there, right? And it's
Exactly.
kind of interesting, because I think what you talk about is, if you can approach those people and those situations with a sense of wonder, and let me get to know this person, really understand. I mean, a couple of things that I think that really tie to that is, I do these things called 8-minute ripples. They're really originally developed them for people that don't like networking for
Mm,
non-networking people. And it was really geared around not having the question of, so Jeffrey, what do you do? And, tell me about your job. And I really just want you to, talk, just so that I can get my 30-second elevator pitch in order to pitch you on whatever. For
right.
me, it was all, I wrote a book on networking, and it's one of my least favorite things to do, but connecting with individuals where you can have a sense of curiosity and wonder about who this person is, why they showed up in your path at the time that they did. And you talk about those as curious questioning. I call ripple connection questions sort of the same thing, right? They're questions that are fun to ask, fun to answer, but they're really designed to drive what I call a connection point. And
Yeah.
the way I tie all this back into what you just said is that if you can find a connection point, even with somebody that you haven't necessarily gotten along with or you've worked with for a long time, but you only know each other through your interactions through work and just the work pure surface connection function of interaction day to day, but you haven't dug below that, you of course things are never going to change, right? But if you can figure out a way to, to learn who they are as individuals, what lights them up, what really excites them about, whatever it is in their world, whether it's the work, whether it's their personal life, etc. Then you really create, you say something in your book about wonder as a heightened state of consciousness and emotion, and that's really what that connection piece is. If I can actually see you through a different lens right now, because now we've worked together and we've never gotten along, but now I see that, oh, we both have kids, or they both like the same sports, or they're into similar activities. And I had no idea because I never asked, right? Well, now all of a sudden, now I look at you from a completely different perspective.
That's exactly right. And even the connection with the differences, right?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
another
Yeah.
interesting part too,
Celebrate
right?
the
Is to
difference,
say,
in fact,
"Oh,
instead of
wow,
shy from them.
I can see you and actually appreciate how your genius is different," right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I can see like, "Oh, your background is different," and that's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. I love everything you said about networking. And I'm sure that comes from your introvert's genius as well. Your genius introvert is like, "I hate networking."
Yeah.
So that was so beautiful. There, some tenets in the chapter on connection too that I lead people through that came from my research and my applied research and testing out, even for myself, how to listen and connect better with people and how to
Yeah.
bust these biases in the moment. And there are usually like three starting practices I guide people through on teams and individually or in circles. So I hold mastermind inner circles, and we practice these as well. And so the first one, I taught myself under a very socially distressing uh, time or during a certain event, is to say to yourself when you are trying to connect with somebody, say to
Uh-huh.
yourself, open up instead of size up, open up
Oh,
instead of
love
size
that.
up.
Yeah.
So you're saying that to
Beautiful.
yourself. And it also, because we do close off, and we're not only closing off the other person, some of us, particularly introverts, will close off because we fear we're being sized up.
Yeah.
And so if we could
And
just
that
say,
affects
open up,
everything, body
it
language, your
does.
communication. Yeah, I mean, it really does activate that way.
It really does. It constricts everything
Yeah.
physically and psychologically. And so to practice that to yourself. And then the second is because I really appreciated what you said about the elevator pitch. You're like, oh yeah, let me listen to your elevator pitch. But the whole time I'm thinking of my own and I can't wait to get
Yeah.
mine out. Right. And so nobody's really listening to anyone.
Yeah. No.
And so except for that chatter in our minds. And so the second is instead of like cogitating in our brains, like, what am I going to say next to add value? To listen with your feet, which is a funny way of saying draw a part of your attention literally to your feet. So
Yes.
you're taking some of that bandwidth, and it's as if, not literally, but as if you're listening more in an open, receptive, almost whole bodied way, so to speak. You're not
Yeah.
trying to jump in and offer what's next. The third is a little bit more existential, but it's it's remembering that this moment is the only one of its kind. Like
Yeah.
this moment between you and me will never happen again. And so just to remind yourself of the brevity of any moment. And sometimes depending on the group I'm working with, I will say, listen as if that person's words are their last words.
Oh,
And then they're
yeah.
like, oh, all
Yeah.
right.
Puts distinct meaning behind everything at that point.
It really does. It helps us
Yeah.
see what really matters.
Absolutely. Well, and it also it helps us recognize the magic in those moments, right? Which we don't often look for if we're not looking for them, right? So
That's right.
that's one of the big keys. I want to be super respectful of your time because I know you were on a limited schedule today. I generally like to wrap up and because I could talk to you for, I mean, and I hope that we could do a follow up because I didn't get to half my questions I wanted to ask you because I'm just so fascinated by you. But I like to wrap up with a few ripple connection questions. It's kind of perfect segue since we just talked about them, but more of an insight about kind of just how you would sort of perceive a few of these, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead. Let's do it.
Awesome. So and I kind of have maybe an inkling of how you might answer this one, but what's the best piece of advice you learned or received as a young person that you still leverage today?
Ooh, gosh. Best piece of advice as a young person that I still leverage today. Wow. I can't believe I've never really thought of that question. I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure it was something my mother said or a teacher who was looking out for me when I was 12 or 13, which was like the lowest ring of the inferno for me. But
You and me both.
yeah.
We should have just been buddies at that point.
Right, exactly. So I honestly I don't know, but I'm sure it was something my mother said about, just being okay with myself. I'm sure. I'm sorry I can't answer
No,
that
that's a
question.
good
It's a
well,
great
no, not
question.
a problem. Well,
Yeah.
let me rephrase then. What would be the best piece of advice you would give to somebody who is thinking about, I really need to check out this tracking wonder. I mean, what it could do for my life personally or professionally.
Yeah, be open to the possibility, right? So if
I
you
love that.
have a certain if you're already curious about experiences of wonder, great. But if like you're like, "What? Wonder?" I just invite you to be open to the
Yep.
possibility because wonder is the most pervasive yet seemingly evasive human experience we have. It's the hallmark of the human species. Yeah.
I love it. That's fantastic. What do you think? Obviously you've been an entrepreneur for a while now, but what's the best thing about being an entrepreneur and leading this, this movement that you are with Tracking Wonder?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The best is seeing the impact. I know that as much as I'm driven by creating and making things and designing really great experiences for people or books or whatever, it's really seeing the difference that this work makes. And so being an entrepreneur is truly wondrous when you're designing something and you see that it actually works
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
makes a
Makes a
difference in
difference.
people's lives, then
Yeah.
that's the greatest reward. Yeah.
I love that. Well, this is the perfect segue follow-up question then. So what's the best thing a client or a colleague could say about Jeffrey Davis?
Wow. Um, that I help them see themselves as they truly are and activate that in every facet of their work and life.
I love that. That's fantastic. Well, okay, two last questions. What does the next 5 years look like for you and your team?
Yeah, we're in the process of simplifying. So we really want to simplify things. The book launch was a big thing. And so as we're working with organizations and teams, as we're working with private individuals and professionals and entrepreneurs, I'm just really wanting to streamline and simplify our systems
Yeah,
um, because things can get unwieldy pretty
very
quickly.
quickly.
um, and there is I can't say too much, but there is at some point when we all feel comfortable with live events again, there will be a multi-day immersion that will be related to tracking wonder, but it's not specific to that. I think it's going to be very exciting, and you'll be required to unplug for a number of days from your
Oh,
devices. Yeah, yeah,
I can't wait to hear what that is and sign up for that for sure.
yeah.
Along that lines, I'm gonna lie. I'm gonna ask you two additional questions. What does the ripple effect mean to you?
Yeah, well, the ripple effect actually means two things to me since I alluded to rippling earlier. It really does mean to me, one, that an experience of wonder really is, it can be brief, but it really does have long lasting, sometimes life changing rippling effects. The second is, and probably more directed to you and knowing your relationship with connection really is like, my aim is not to make a big splash in the world. My aim is to make a difference, maybe a pebble at a time.
Yeah,
Um, where those things with whatever I do or say will have a rippling effect. And if I can empower other people to, in turn, have a really positive rippling effect with the work they do, the work they bring out into the world, then that's what I think I'm here for.
absolutely. Well, I would call you a rippler to the highest order. I promise you're making a difference out there in the world, and I think you're doing. You might start with the small pebbles and the small impacts, but your ripple effect is going out there and making a huge difference in the world. My final question to you, because I'm a big believer in this question, as I mentioned earlier, is how can I help you? What could I do
Ah,
for you to create a positive ripple in your life or for your work or
that's great, Steve. You're already doing it by just bringing me on here and sharing and sort of spreading the wonder. Um, I do have 5 wishes at the end of the book, so you can bring wonder home.
okay?
Really important.
Yeah.
So, just recognizing the geniuses at home, those people we're most familiar with, sometimes it's the hardest. Um, the second is bring wonder to your work, which I think you're doing. Um, Third is bring wonder back to the engine and heart of education and learning. And I don't mean just formal education, I mean lifelong
Agreed.
learning and
Yes.
reskilling and upskilling. Fourth is to bring wonder to your mind, right? To really not pathologize our minds, but just to really recognize our human minds are very complex and full of mysteries, and to bring more wonder to investigating your own mind. And fifth, in whatever ways you can, Steve, I know it's 109 there and you're part of the planet, but bring wonder to a part of the natural world as well. That's the whole source of our human experience with wonder.
I love that. That's great. Well, if I can do anything for you, aside from I will continue to be a big, big supporter of your work and promoter of it. I've turned several people on to the book. I plan to do a lot more, but I'm so grateful for this time and this opportunity to have the conversation with you. Before we go, let everybody know how they can find you. You've got your social channels, so I wanted you to share what you wanted or where you wanted people to follow you or how to learn more about your work.
Absolutely. So trackingwonder.com has hundreds upon hundreds of free articles and new videos that are coming out every Sunday in August and part of September called Canoe Talks, where you'll get like a 8 or 10 minute video of me in my canoe responding to some reader's question. Second, you might check out the Tracking Wonder column on Psychology Today for other articles I've written. And Steve, we'll send along a special URL for your listeners and viewers where they can download the first chapter of the book, Tracking Wonder.
Well,
They
thank
can
you.
also take a Wonder at Work assessment. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be great. Yes. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. We really
Yeah.
appreciate it. Well, I just want to say, Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming on the Ripple Effect podcast. I know our conversation has to end, but this is not the end. I promise we're going to stay in contact. We're going to find some ways to create some wonder and create some positive ripples together. I promise you here in the near future. So I am so thankful for you. Everybody will be back with another episode of the Ripple Effect podcast very soon. But until then, Jeffrey and everyone out there, ripple on.
Ripple on. Thanks, Steve.